Well, shooters and reloaders out there, Fortune Cookie 45LC coming to you from the Hot Lead Zone. And a couple days ago, I got a package from Alabama. And it's from Pay Law. And Paul, you know who you are, and I really appreciate you sending me this. This happens to be a book. But not just any book, it's the Complete Guide to Handloading by Phillip Sharpe. Now, Phillip Sharpe was a noted author in the shooting industry many years ago, and this book was first published in 1937. And so it may seem like it's old, but yet it's very comprehensive, and it takes history from that point on and goes back in a comprehensive fashion, much more than we can look at history today, because we're a lot more distantly from that point in time. So here you see a picture of Harry Pope talking to the author Phillip Sharpe. And a lot of us have heard about Harry Pope because he was big back at the turn of the century in shooting and development and reloading and all of that kind of thing. But a lot of us don't know what Harry Pope looks like. Well, thanks to Pay Law, and that's Paul. Thank you so much, because now we know what Harry Pope looks like. In fact, this book is dedicated to Harry Pope. And look at that table of contents. Talks about so many things that are very pertinent and has a lot of relevance to today. But for those of you who think that 1937 is so distant, so long ago, let me tell you some things about 1937 that maybe you knew, maybe you didn't. 1937 was a very turbulent time. The winds of war were brewing in Europe and also in Asia. And there were already wars. Nazi Germany was busy helping sides in the Spanish Civil War, and while they were doing that, they were using their air force to perfect the techniques of blitzkrieg that they would be using in 1939 when they took over Europe. And in Asia, Japan was already in Manchuria and had already invaded China. And they were prosecuting their war in China, and the Japanese Air Force was busy bombing and doing all of their target practice in the Chinese theater, perfecting all of their techniques to the day that they would be attacking Pearl Harbor. Now in America, FDR had just gotten inaugurated for his second term, and the United States was way behind in arms development, aircraft, and shipbuilding. The Nazis were already showcasing their expertise with the Hindenburg that was touring the United States, and they had a bad accident in New Jersey where the Hindenburg disaster, the airship burned. There was tremendous interest in aircraft in those days. Howard Hughes was big. And 1937 was also the year that Amelia Earhart disappeared. The nations of the world were concerned about international piracy that was happening in the Mediterranean Sea. Does that sound kind of familiar to what's happening around the shores of Africa today? In domestic news, one of the big things was in Chicago, the police opened fire on demonstrators that were unarmed, killing 10 in the notorious Memorial Day massacre. On a more peaceful note, the common cans of Spam that we enjoy today first introduced in 1937. Also, 1937 was the year that nylon was invented, and women's stockings and hosiery have never been the same since. And that was the year that Look magazine first hit the shelves, as well as Detective Comics. And Detective Comics goes all the way till the present day. And Abraham Lincoln was added to the other 3 presidents on Mount Rushmore. 1937 was the beginning of the criminalization of marijuana. And a young Walt Disney made a big mark for himself and his company with the release of the first full-length animated movie, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. In the U.S. military, the M1 Garand had been adopted the year before and had not yet taken over in the inventories of the Army and Marine Corps. For the U.S. Navy, the battleships North Carolina and very soon to be Washington were going to be U.S. battleships that mounted the new 16-inch guns. Now, looking at this book, The Complete Guide to Handloading by Phillip Sharpe, one of the first things that we notice is it talks about cartridge cases, and it mentions that the life of cartridge cases is anywhere from 10 to 50 reloadings. And not only that, but it talks about the fact that cartridge cases can be reloaded almost indefinitely if taken care of and properly used. And cartridge cases were mentioned in different classifications of rimmed cases, rimless, semi-rimmed, and belted, like the belted magnums. Now, one that they did not mention that came later was the rebated type of case, where the body of the case is actually bigger than the rim. To show how relevant the information in this book is, it mentions that the predictions that Phil Sharpe made were that we would be using cartridges today that would be able to handle pressures in the 100,000 psi range. Well, we haven't gotten there. In fact, the pressures that they were dealing with back then, 55,000 psi, that's basically where we are right now. We might have gotten to 60,000 psi, but we definitely are not at 100,000. But it predicted 100,000 here. And interestingly, back in 1937, they were talking about steel cases because steel cases were nothing new in 1937. But it talked about how aluminum would be a material for cartridge cases, especially the high-tech aluminum alloys that were stronger than steel. Well, we have that today. And it mentions beryllium copper as a material that could be used for making cartridge cases that would enable 100,000 psi. Well, we haven't gotten to beryllium copper today, but beryllium copper actually made inroads in the making of golf clubs not too long ago. Now, it talks about the importance of case inspection and the dreaded head separations or partial head separations, and we just had an incident of that today with this particular case that has a little bit of pressure leakage right here. So whenever you see a lot of powder residue on the head of a case and not on the body, you've got to suspect a head separation or partial head separation. And when you fire around, especially the AR platform, if you see a little bit of smoke puff out of the action when you fire the shot, you have to be suspicious of a head separation with that piece of brass that just came out of that gun. If you're lucky, you only got a partial head separation and not a complete head separation like this one right here, where it mentions that the shooter would have been lucky if they were wearing glasses because otherwise they would have been blinded. Now, back in those days, they were dealing with the mercuric primers, and we don't have those today, but in those days there was still residual mercuric primers that were being run into, and mercuric primers caused brittling of the brass, and the brass would actually break. Take the bullet, give it a little twist like that, and it snaps right off. That's because of the corrosive nature of mercuric primers. Now, of course, bullet casting is huge in this book, and it says that there are 2 basic kinds of hand loaders. One kind that casts their own bullets, and the other kind that does not. That breakdown is applicable today. Let me read you a little bit here that sounds like it came right out of a modern manual. It says here, today, and that's 1937, but today there are nearly a dozen makers of bullet molds. You can buy special bullets, all cast. You can buy any type of mold and cast your own, or you could design your own mold, have it made to order, and thereby have a highly distinctive bullet, which may or may not do things the way you originally expected. That sounds very contemporary. Look at that. There's the Seiko lubricizer as if it were purchased right off the shelves of Midway USA today. And here's something my friend Dave Thorzak 777 up in Seattle, Washington area, little town called Poulsbo. Something he would appreciate. That there is the Star lubricizer machine, much coveted even in this year of 2017. Now, interestingly, in those days, of course, they had no powder-coated bullets, but what they had instead were paper patch. And with paper patch bullets, they had bullets that were smooth-sided and were a little bit smaller than what they wanted, so they could paper patch the bullet right up to groove diameter. Sounds a lot like powder coating today. Interesting. Look at that drawing of the cast bullet, almost straight out of the NOE Molds website. Lavrin was big in those days. Small little grooves. Look just like Richard Lee's tumble lube design. This book could model a present day reloading manual. Look at that. Close-up of powder. There's close-up of primers. It talks about the bullets, the various steps of reloading, the importance of weighing and measuring powder charges. Here are a bunch of powder measures. And look at this. This looks exactly like the Lee Autodrum powder measure of today. Very similar. And look at this. There are reloading data for popular calibers in this book. Here's a bullet puller. Very similar to the bullet puller designs that we have now. Wonder where those all came from. At any rate, this is a great book. I know we're getting a little long with this, but again, I really appreciate Pay Law. That's Paul in the great state of Alabama. And when we think about Alabama, we think Crimson Tide, so go Tide, go Crimson. Best to you, Paul. Thanks so much. And that's Pay Law. Bye for now.